So yesterday, if you turned on the TV to watch anything at all, you probably saw something about January 6th. And it is a date that the media, of course, would say lives in infamy, just like Pearl Harbor. Like we were talking about a minute ago, I think the left and the media especially are trying to directly link January 6th to things like Pearl Harbor and 9/11, because that will give them not just a politically handy tool for 2022 or 2024. They think it'll be handy for 2046, whatever that. I mean, they think it'll be handy for generations going forward. That's what they're trying to do. They are trying to brand this into American minds. Mm-hmm. So it got me to thinking, gosh, has there been anything else like that in American history? And you know what? There have. Now, a lot of you who are watching, I think, are probably old enough to remember the two things I'm going to talk about here in a moment. What was interesting is in our staff meeting this morning where we were talking about the show, I mentioned this, and no disparagement meant, but neither Tara nor Grant had heard of the main story I'm going to tell you. And that's because it wasn't useful for the media and the left to put the story out there. Back in 1983, this was in, I think, November. You know what's wonderful, folks? Just as an aside, the best thing in the world is when you're 5 minutes from going on air and the printer prints your stuff out too big so that you have 90% of what you need, but the 10% right here, totally gone.
Yeah, that's great.
It's just fantastic. But back on, let's see here. This was on November 7th, 1983. November 7th, 1983. The Capitol switchboard got a very ominous sounding call. About 15 minutes later, a literal bomb went off that blew not a dent, but a gaping hole in the Capitol building's wall. It's not a wall outside. This is not a fence. This is the actual wall of the building. It blew a hole in the wall. If you haven't heard of that, it's no mistake. You weren't supposed to ever hear about it. Yeah, it happened in 1983, but it never served the media's purpose to bring it back up. After all, it doesn't hurt conservatives. It doesn't hurt Christians. It doesn't hurt Trump supporters. It hurts the left. And the reason for that is it wasn't a random bombing. There was a group called the, it's nice when the group's name is hidden in the 10% that didn't get printed. The Black Liberation Army, there it is. Thankfully, they mentioned it elsewhere. The Black Liberation Army, and they were sort of an offshoot of the Weather Underground. They carried out several other bombings up to, I think it ran into about 20 different bombings over time. Now, we were talking about this in the meeting before the show, and it just occurred to me, gosh, if I'm weighing out consequences, if I'm trying to figure out which scenario is worse, we've got one scenario where we have Nancy Pelosi's mail stolen, okay? And we've got one scenario where a 15-foot hole was blown in the Capitol building.
Yeah, but was the guy who blew a 15-foot hole in the Capitol building wearing a Viking
I knew you were going to
garb?
ask. That's a legitimate question, my friend. A legitimate question. When you wear an animal pelt, it really makes it more significant. No, but that is the point. When you look at, again, I've said this on this show so many times. Go back and watch the footage of what happened on January 6th. Not all the footage that they showed yesterday. Look at the footage of what was happening in the Capitol building. And you have my favorite kind of terrorists there. You have the kind of terrorists that stand in between stanchions. Stanchions are those things at the bank that keep you in line. You have terrorists literally standing in the stanchions. And as we talked about earlier today, that's not terrorism. So contrast that against a giant gaping hole being blown in the wall of the Capitol, which is sacred ground according to the media. And by the way, there are a few people around who are more patriotic than I am, but seriously, the stuff that goes on in the Capitol building, the smarm, the sex, the wheeling and dealing, the smoke-filled rooms, really, that's sacred ground. But this is not the only case. I mentioned the Weather Underground a minute ago. Many of you who are watching know about the Weather Underground. For those of you who don't or who may have forgotten, remember the Weather Underground was behind 25 or 26 significant terrorist bombings across the country back in the 60s and 70s. They hit a military recruitment center. They hit the U.S. State Department, and they hit several other official and unofficial places. When you look at the history of the left, terrorism is endemic. Terrorism comes with the left. And maybe a more convenient way to say it, or a more useful way to say it is that terrorism comes with stateism. The idea that the state should be all powerful. Where else do we see terrorism today? Well, we see it in the Middle East. We see it with radical Islam. Radical Islam is a fascist statist movement. Mm-hmm. There's the machinations of the groups behind those things are different, but their methods as far as controlling the entire state and using terror to gain that control is no different, whether you're talking about Islamofascism or you're talking about leftism. So it is not surprising at all that this comes from the left. And again, just to put a fine point on it, the best example the media has right now of something like that happening among conservatives was a rally that turned rough on January 6th, where people did trespass into the Capitol. There's a legitimate question whether or not you can trespass on taxpayer property that you funded. And stole some mail. That's the best example they've got. We have bombing after bombing after bombing. We have the 100 million plus who were killed by leftism in the 20th century. I don't know how many were killed by conservatism, but it wasn't 100 million.
No way.
Yeah.
The closest thing they'll try to do is march out Pinochet, and that's fraught with problems. So anyway, on the anniversary, just after the anniversary, after the ridiculous media January 6th orgy that took place yesterday, I want to remind people of what the left's actually capable of and what they have done. The left and the media wish that what happened on November 7th, 1983 happened on January 6th, 2021, but it didn't. Again, some mail was stolen and some people got jostled.